Hey everyone, it's the Mystic Midwife, helping birth new self-awareness through astrology. This is your weekly astrological forecast for the week of Sunday, January 12th through Saturday, January 18th. If you recall from last week's horoscope, we were leading up to the big event, which is happening today. If you're listening today, it's Sunday, January 12th, and that will be the giant stellium in Capricorn happening with our Saturn and Pluto conjuncting at 22 degrees as the two main actors. We're going to get into that in just a minute. Like last week, I want to just take a moment to reflect on where we've been. So, if you were paying attention to how you were feeling, you might have noticed that this past Friday, which was a full moon, and in fact it was a Cancer lunar eclipse, brought with it some potentially unexpected emotional ups or downs, depending on where it was hitting in your chart. That was when we had the moon opposing a whole bunch of stuff going on in Capricorn that we're about to get into. And because it is eclipse season, it's bringing all sorts of really interesting things to the surface to be purged, to be switched out, to be changed. It's sort of a pivot point, as we mentioned, and a great opportunity to seed new things. Now, different astrologers will talk about looking at different time frames to observe eclipses, but you generally hear that things maybe 2 weeks before to 2 weeks after the eclipse period is when you might start to see some things happening, up until even the next eclipse cycle. Now, that can be really challenging to understand if something that happened during this time was significant. And maybe the better way to think about it is what new things were seeded. Maybe that might have seemed small, but that were quite significantly different. So for instance, maybe you woke up with a different perspective about something. Maybe your emotions changed abruptly on something else. Perhaps you had some relationships or even a relationship to a job or a project in your life where you just woke up and felt completely done. Or something maybe came into your life as a new opportunity. You had been thinking about it, or even not. But the point is that there was something a little bit new, fresh, or different that served as a pivot point. And this can really be a seeding point, the start of something much longer. So it's just important to keep that all in mind coming into this week, that we're coming out of a pretty emotional week. As we discussed, we had some of that more dreamy, introspective Neptune energy at the beginning of the week, culminating or leading up to that potentially emotional moon that we dealt with on Friday. So now let's take a look at this week, and particularly, as I mentioned, what's happening at the start of the week, which is January 12th, Sunday. So what an amazing stellium that we have happening in Capricorn. Not only do we have Saturn and Pluto conjuncting, which happens, once every 32 to 35, 37 years, and then we have Mercury and the Sun joining it as well. And they're all hugging right around that 22 degree mark. At the same time, we have Jupiter in the south node conjuncting around 8 or 9 degrees. And from an archetypal astrology perspective that uses larger orbs, it's within the 15 degree orb as well. So we have a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Now, it's been interesting to observe as an astrologer, as somebody who's known about this upcoming conjunction and sort of waiting with bated breath what's going to happen. And I'm sure that anybody who was watching the news with maybe some geopolitical things happening in the run-up, there was a big concern. There was, what could possibly happen around this conjunction, right? Because we know that with Saturn and Pluto, it's a pretty tumultuous, intense, dark, potentially difficult energy. So, if you see these headlines, there's this chance that there's a lot of fear that maybe something big could actually happen. The important thing to remember is that these longer term cycles don't culminate necessarily at a particular moment, right? Because it takes them a longer amount of time to orbit around, their cycles are longer, and the amount of time that they're within orb, meaning that they're in a place to actually reflect some ongoing changes in our lives, is much longer than, say, a Mercury transit. That's pretty quick. We see that all the time. So even though January 12th is the day, the point is we're still going to be having Saturn and Pluto interacting with one another and within that 15-degree orb all the way up until November 2021. And Jupiter is going to get even closer and join Saturn in March of 2020. So even though this is like the moment that everyone has been talking about, we have to remember that it's within a much longer cycle. But it is a really great opportunity to sit and reflect a little bit on what these energies mean and how we can start observing them in our lives and make them work for us. So the first thing that I'll just mention before we talk a little bit more about Saturn and Pluto is that we have the Sun and Mercury, which really just brings a lot of clarity and attention to these archetypes that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment. So it's just extra emphasis in this part of the chart, to put it quite simply. But let's take a moment to just reflect on why there is some fear surrounding Saturn and Pluto. It's interesting that it evokes such fear because that's really its job archetypally, and it's doing a good job for anybody who's watching these cycles and being concerned. But, maybe you're feeling that generally, but you don't know exactly why that is and why that might relate to this cycle. So let's just take a moment to reflect on that a little bit. So let's look at Saturn, right? When we're thinking about the principle of constriction, of time, of boundaries, of cold, hard reality. Anytime Saturn is at play in our charts or globally, with these longer term transits like we're dealing with now, we're really forced to, just take a cold, hard look at where we are and perhaps have those dreams compressed or brought in, or the reality of the difficulty of something comes in, right? It's just that feeling that we can't always get what we want. And even if we work really hard, maybe we haven't worked hard enough. Or sometimes Saturn comes in to show that we have these attachments to things, and those things can be, by those things being taken away, right? Whether it's the passing of a loved one, the ending of a job, the ending of a relationship, right? The end, it's bounded. Things are finite. That's what Saturn reminds us. So for people, and that's pretty much goes for everybody, right? Who's attached to something in your life, right? When you think about the fact that it's going to be over at some point, that's Saturn. So what happens then when we add Pluto to the mix, right? Pluto represents this deeper, quote, evolutionary life force within us. It's sort of like the most raw and true and pure form that we could possibly have of ourselves. And it represents death, rebirth, transformation from one phase to another in our lives. And so when you sort of bring these two together, you have cold, hard reality and potentially really challenging circumstances to remake you in some aspect of your life. So if you think about it, I guess there is reason at some level to be afraid, but it's really, I think, only because we may be afraid of change. And so I would just really encourage anyone listening to think about what is it that you may have fear of change about. Is there something that you're holding on to that maybe it's something that has comforted you in the past, but that no longer serves that purpose? There's Saturn showing there's an end. And then what could it transform into? How can we move through that into something else? And Pluto can offer those really great alternative ways to remake who we are and how we relate to the world and create something new within ourselves. So there is that positive lining. But I can't sort of sit here and just say that it's all simple and easy and a matter of change and embracing transformation, because quite honestly, there are gods and goddesses from many different mythic traditions, many different religions around the world that reflect these dark, destructive energies. And it's not to say that they're evil, but the point is that they are intense and they demand a lot of us as humans having this experience on the planet, right? The point is you can't get rid of something without experiencing the grief. You could say that, I'm fine, I'm going to move on, but that at some level, you're probably glossing over something, right? There is some attachment because we're inherently human. We're inherently stuck in these bodies. We have emotions about things. And so when these dark gods and goddesses come a-calling as represented by some of these Saturn-Pluto dynamics, it's really to purge you, right? There's that destructive, purifying fire that can just come and just unleash and burn all over you, right? And it demands complete surrender. So what can we feel? We can feel grief, immense pain, shock. We can feel like perhaps we don't know where to go and that there's no point at a certain level because of the amount of pain. But that's what those archetypal energies, that's what those gods and goddesses demand of us, right? So if you want to pass, you want to move on to the next level, you can't bypass, you can't jump over that darkness. No, you have to be able to lie down at the foot of those entities, those deities, and really lay yourself bare and just give up to whatever happens, to however you feel. And, it's a purifying fire, as I said, which means that it's not going to completely char you. It's just going to get rid of everything that is non-essential. So at a simple level, it could be maybe your attachment to a certain job, and you just kind of got to give up, let it go. Maybe that was something you were attached to because you thought you had to prove yourself in a certain context, but then you realize that that has no value to you anymore because you've grown, you have value in yourself inherently, but you still need to grieve and mourn the loss of all of the energy that you dumped into creating that career for yourself, which at this point maybe no longer matters. And then what does that mean for everything that you've done and invested, right? It doesn't mean that you did anything wrong or that you should regret it, but it's still, there's some grief there, right? So that's the kind of thing that you can bring up. And that's sort of maybe one small side of the spectrum. Whereas, if you're going through an actual ego death in a sense where that particular experience that I mentioned is reflected everywhere and at the same time. So it's happening in your job. Maybe you're also losing a place of where you live or your relationships or how you relate to yourself, how you relate to the world. It can feel really painful when all of a sudden you no longer fit in to who you thought you were or who you thought you should become. And you have no idea where you should be going. And that's a really painful process, right? Ultimately, those purifying fires, if you feel that pain and sadness, you'll move through and come out on the other end. But as I mentioned, it demands time. You have to go there. And so if we can work with these purifying energies, we can understand that they're going to be difficult. We can understand that we cannot bypass them. We have to go in. We have to feel them. Then we can start to see this amazing gift that we have with Saturn-Pluto and these archetypal energies that are highlighted right now to really start looking at ourselves existentially in a sense. Who are we? What are we doing individually as a culture? What do we want to remake? What do we need to grieve or mourn that we haven't? There's so many great opportunities to really take stock of what we've built, who we've become, and who we want to become, and then to go through that purging process that will take us to the next step, even if we're not quite sure what that next step is. The other thing that I'll mention is Jupiter on the South Node, also in Capricorn, with an orb of all this going on at 22 degrees with Saturn and Pluto. And from the evolutionary astrology perspective, right, the South Node represents the past, the ancestors, the experiences that you've had in past lives, or even just the skills, abilities, and proclivities that you have just inherently coming into this world. So globally, with our collective South Node in Capricorn, it kind of reflects this like, oh yeah, we've been really good at this, this whole like capitalistic growth mindset in a sense, this sort of sacrifice emotion for the creation of something for material gain, for growing and being an influencer, right? This sort of creation of excellence and this capitalistic, paternalistic sort of approach to the world and take and conquer. But we actually are being called in the opposite direction, which is in Cancer, the North Node, which is what was highlighted by the eclipse last week. But anyway, with Jupiter on the South Node, it's really emphasizing and bringing up a lot of these older patterns collectively and individually. So if you've had experiences that have really brought up anything from ancestors, family history, old patterning, things that have really brought a lot of pain to your life, and even some really healing, amazing things emerging from your past or from your family, things that are able to be healed now that maybe weren't before, all of that is also playing into this interesting mix that's happening, right? So we're highlighting the older part of our family lineages, our own personal lives. We're bringing it up for complete assessment and reassessment and working through. And, as I mentioned, this is just a moment when they're conjunct, which can be significant, but it also could just be another moment in this very long continuum. So just know that you got, probably about another year. Anyway, we'll be checking in about this, but that these energies are heightened right now. Take advantage of them, but that you will have the ability to keep working on this. And so use this as a chance to really dig deep over the next several months to a year. Okay, so all that was just for the very first day of the week for this report, which is the 12th. And so where do we go from there, right? It's important to note some of the smaller things that we might be feeling throughout the week that can really help color some of how we might be interpreting these larger archetypal energies that I just mentioned. So let's take a look at the rest of the week. I'm not going to spend too much time on each of these smaller aspects, but they are important to at least note. So we have had for a little while Venus in Aquarius, which has, it's something that we really need to stop and appreciate. A lot of people will say, oh, it's detached, that sort of thing. But really, Venus in Aquarius can provide us with this amazing universal perspective, tolerance for other people, other perspectives, being more permissive, compassionate, humanitarian. It allows that distance, but also integration. It might not have that super interpersonal warmth, but if you think about it, what a great pairing to have this at the terminal degrees, Venus in Aquarius, while we're having all this Capricornian assessment and review. But on Monday, we have Venus moving into a slightly less detached, a little bit more free-flowing position in the zodiac, which is in Pisces. So Venus will be moving into Pisces, where she's exalted. She loves it there. And so that will feel like a little bit of a relief. And that'll come pretty quick. So that will give you an opportunity to really lean into a little bit, everything from just more interpersonal warmth and desires and more sensual experiences to more spiritual, quite honestly, and having that desire to connect more broadly, coming out of that material realm and expanding outward. So really lean into that opportunity as it emerges and you start to feel the edges of that coming into play on Monday the 13th. Okay, so once we're into Tuesday, we don't have a whole lot of big aspects outside of what we already discussed, but we have the moon now in Virgo. This will give us a great opportunity to look at everything that has come up, everything that we have observed during the eclipse cycle. It will give us the ability to look analytically through our feelings, how we're feeling emotionally, how it is expressed in our bodies, and to really understand how to start integrating and working with this in a healing way, right? Because Virgo can discriminate, it can heal, it can integrate. So it is a great opportunity to use that to get a little bit more in order after potentially feeling a little discombobulated over the past week or so. Then on Wednesday the 15th, we have a sweet sextile between Venus and Pisces and Uranus and Taurus. At the same time, we have a nice moon in Libra, which only adds to the sweetness, I think, and the little bit of a different change in the energy. So as soon as we have this ingress with Venus moving into Pisces, it gets this great shot of inspiration from Uranus, right? And whenever Venus and Uranus are together, you can have a whole variety of great, inspiring, sizzling, eccentric, interesting sort of sensual experiences to opportunities for a little bit of like quirky aesthetic looks and feels. It's that great principle from Uranus of eccentricity and creativity, insight, shooting over to Venus, which is obviously focused more on the sensual, the desirous nature in ourselves. And so it can form this really beautiful opportunity to feel inspired in some aesthetic way, in some sensual way, something maybe relating to spirituality and that deeper connection to something bigger, which again is just this beautiful shot that we get to sort of revive us in a sense after we've been through so much last week, and then a little bit of the analytic stuff with the moon in Virgo, and then moving into a totally different feel once we get to about midweek. Then on Thursday the 16th, we have yet another planet changing signs. So we're going to see a lot of shifting of energy in general throughout this week as it progresses. You'll see things may feel quite different as the week progresses, and definitely at the end as compared to the beginning, because we have Mercury moving into Aquarius on the 16th. So with Aquarius being this air sign that loves that perspective, the analytic mindset, we talked a little bit about Venus being there and having that ability to integrate, to observe systems, to sort of see how things interact and have that amazing, permissive, tolerance, humanitarian approach. And now Mercury is just sort of the form where we're intellectually capable to start looking at things from all different perspectives, to see the connections, to understand things in a broader way, right? So this is a great opportunity, again, to be vacillating between some of these emotions that have come up with the analytic perspective, feelings, and then being able to integrate. So it's a great back and forth as the week progresses. Then on Friday the 17th, continuing with this theme of back and forth, the moon will move into Scorpio, and we got a bunch of different moon aspects there. We have the moon squaring Mercury, we have it opposing Uranus, trining Venus, squaring the sun. I'm not going to go through every single one of those, but the point is it's as the moon is in this rather deep, brooding, a little bit more intense, inner reflective space. It's sort of making aspects to these different parts of ourselves, right? Our minds, maybe the way that we've gotten this new perspective on life, how we might be feeling about things, how we identify with the world. And it's this opportunity to reflect and think about and kind of sit with at a deeper level some of the stuff that has come up over the past week. So sometimes those moons in Scorpio can be a little bit rough, but understand that it's a great opportunity to continue to go deep, right? Don't be afraid, and to see how you can kind of integrate and bring a little bit of smoother energy at a deeper level for yourself and moving through some potential changes or shifts that are happening in your life. Then we wrap up the week with another stroke of genius and insight from Uranus and Taurus, which is now direct, and it squares Mercury, which is now in Aquarius. So now this is, again, right, this opportunity for this great insight. We've just been in the deeper internal world in Scorpio, and then on Saturday we can emerge with a little bit of like a spark of insight, that creative way of thinking about it. Maybe we've been stuck on something and we don't know how to work it, but now with this opportunity we can see it from that new perspective. We can see how things can better integrate. So overall, this week is a really interesting back and forth with lots of opportunities to integrate the lessons that we've learned last week in the eclipse season, the past couple of weeks, into, right, the heart of this Saturn-Pluto intensity that we're going to be feeling for quite some time. but use this as a chance to highlight and bracket some major themes, right? If something is new, if something feels different, remember it, come back to it, put a bookmark on it, because you're likely to see these themes repeating. So anytime that you can get this week to go inward, particularly with that nice moon in Scorpio on Friday, and to sort of feel through things, to integrate, and then to, of course, take that stroke of insight with your feelings as it comes with the Venus-Uranus sextile on Wednesday, or the Uranus-Mercury square on Saturday, right? Take those. Pay attention to them. Understand that this is the start of a new cycle, because as Saturn and Pluto come together this one time, that is it. This is truly the end of an old cycle, and it's moving forward, right? They're never meeting like this with this current cycle again. There will be a little retrograde, but they're not going to be conjuncting again. So this is now the start of something new. So you can also lean into that and understand you might be working through some old patterns, but start paying attention to the seeds and the patterns and the new directions, the new feelings, the new places that you're drawn and pulled to in this week, because I think it's going to be providing you some really interesting signposts and new directions for the very deeper part of you that is having, I was going to say facelift, but it's deeper than that, right? A remake as you're going through these intense few weeks. So everybody just hang in there. Really, really great job working with these challenging energies, right? This is not for the faint of heart. Don't be afraid to go deep, but also give yourself that time to reflect and integrate and pay attention to the signs that you're receiving about where things are going to be coming, where you'll be heading in the next Saturn-Pluto cycle and beyond. And look forward to checking in with you again next week. Next week, we're going to have a sign change where we're going to be moving into Aquarius after a lot of this Capricorn intensity. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will talk to you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.